put together a video to help customers install the machine clutch sheath. We've already on this Rhino removed the seats and the center console just to get access to the clutch right here. Now when you get the sheath will look like this. You'll have your machine sheath with new seals, and you'll also have a bag with 8 nuts and a spacer. Now, first step is to get the clutch cover off. To do that, oh, and by the way, if you have a pretty pimp stereo system in your Rhino, you're gonna have to remove it to get access to this clutch. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna remove the 2 clamps, one here and one here, to move this coolant pipe so we can remove this clutch cover. So we're gonna go ahead and do that right now. Now there are 2 bolts in the center of the clutch cover. Make sure you remove those, as well as the bolts that go all around the outside of the cover. Well, we've gone ahead and removed the actual bolts all around the clutch cover and the 2 bolts in the center right here. We've also dropped down this coolant pipe below this bracket to clearance to remove the cover. Take the cover, a little bit tricky. Swing the cover down through here, pop it up through here, come right out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to remove the 4 bolts that hold the primary clutch support on. Pull the support out, and while you have the support out, it's best to pull the hardware out of it so you don't lose the hardware while you're trying to maneuver it out. The support will come out to about here, and then if you just turn it a little bit, it'll come right out. Right here I'm going to show you how to compress the belt into the secondary clutch. You take a pry bar, a rag, put it over the face of the pry bar. You drop the pry bar in right about here. And then as you work the pry bar in, you'll push down on the belt, and this will actually hold this belt loose over the primary clutch. Now we're looking at the primary clutch. Right here, we're going to remove the primary clutch by removing this nut right here. It's best to use an impact on this nut. You want to make sure that your socket is deep enough to clearance the shaft right here. It takes a 22mm socket and an impact to remove this nut. Go ahead and you'll remove the nut and the washer that's behind it. Put these aside. At this point we go ahead and we slide off the primary sheath. We'll slide the sheet off, then you're going to have this collar right here. At this point in time, we can go ahead, take the collar, and put it back there. Now we're just going to work on this piece. Start by removing the 8 screws that hold on this retainer plate. At this point in time, it's actually pretty good to go ahead and if you got some gloves, on some gloves, it gets real messy from here on in. Yeah. These plates, there's an O-ring below them, so you just kind of work around it a little bit, and eventually I'll let you pull up the plate. Take that, the O-ring, put that aside. Now we're going to go ahead, move the cam plate. Let me just show you real quick here. This cam plate on this particular customer's bike has splines on the inside of it. These splines go on the end of the crankshaft. These splines are not lined up perfectly with the end of the crankshaft. It'll chew them up. And as you can see in this customer's, they're almost completely wiped out. This cam plate would need to be replaced. Now we're ready for our new clutch grease. At this point, we go ahead and we swap out the rollers. You actually want to take a look at the rollers and the Teflon bushing that's over these rollers to make sure they're not cracked or any flat spots in them. Yep, they're only going to fit into 8 slots. So this is how the new rollers should look, well, the rollers should look installed into the new clutch. At this point, you want to transfer grease from your existing clutch, put it in this clutch, or if you have new grease from Yamaha, you can go ahead and put that in there now. And apply it to the rollers. All kind of gooed up. It's looking pretty much just need the grease for the rollers and the ramps that they ride on. Now I'm going to go ahead and take a rag, clean up around the outside of this clutch. You want the grease to stay inside the clutch. Make sure it's got these 4 bushings on it, and these bushings go on these towers right here. So you take the cam plate and drop it down and make sure it fully seats. Take our O-ring, Wipe a little bit of grease off of it. And just maneuver it over the clutch a little bit. Make sure the O-ring sits all the way down on its step. Step a little bit here. Now these new machine clutches, they'll have nuts and studs already installed into the clutch themselves. These studs are actually preset to a height to allow for clearance when you put on the new nuts outside. So you leave that installed just like that. We go ahead and we install the retainer plate on top of the new studs. Now you kind of work it around because what you're trying to do is you're trying to go over this O-ring inside this clutch. You want to make sure it's firmly seated all the way before installing any hardware to prevent pinching the O-ring. Okay. Now we got our hardware. We'll have 8 nuts and a spacer. Take these nuts, thread them down onto the studs. Now we go through and we snug down all the nuts. At this point you want to take a visual inspection to make sure that the stud is not protruding more than 2 threads above this nut. If it is, then you need to remove this plate, go back in, and reset the height of that stud. You also want to make sure that there's enough thread so it's just about flush. That's pretty much how they should be installed, just about flush with the nut. Now to tighten these up, just a little bit of pressure. If you over tighten these, you'll actually break the stud. It's best that you use a nut driver to tighten these rather than a wrench. And it takes a 7 millimeter socket to tighten these nuts. Now that we've reassembled the clutch, we're going to want to go ahead and install this new spacer. The spacer is placed right over the splines on that collar. While you're holding the clutch cam plate in place, you're going to want to install this. If this plate moves out, then the rollers can dislodge, get in there sideways, and then the clutch won't work properly. When you're installing the primary sheave, you're going to want to make sure that this belt is actually compressed into the secondary sheave. This will allow enough slack up here so when you install your primary sheave and you fully engage it on the splines, that it sits firmly up against the collar and the spacer. If it's hanging up on the belt, these splines inside here on this cam plate will not fully engage with the splines on the end of the crankshaft. And if you tighten the nut down at this point, it's going to strip these splines out and the clutch will not operate properly. Now with the clutch firmly seated up against the collar and the spacer, we're going to go ahead and install this washer and install the nut. Using our impact again, we go ahead and tighten this up. Now we're ready to install the actual primary clutch support. Primary clutch support has dowel pin areas here and here. These 2 areas right here will actually get the longer screws that you removed. There's 2 short ones and there's 2 long ones. So as you put this in, you're going to want to make note of which ones have dowels. This lower one right here, the lower front and the upper rear both have dowel pins, so those actually get the longer bolts. Long bolt here, long bolt here. I'm going to go ahead and tighten the 4 bolts for the support. Now we're ready to install our cover. Putting this clutch cover on, you want to get all the bolts started and partially threaded in before tightening any of the bolts. The cover's so big that if you start tightening the bolts right away, by the time you get to your last bolt, it's not really going to want to thread in properly and you may cross-thread it. Now it's time to move the coolant line back into place. Do this by moving your speaker wire out of the way. And install your 2 screws. Now we're ready to put the Rhino all the way back together. Clutch is successfully installed. Machine clutches will actually give the Rhinos a capable top speed of about 65 miles an hour. It does this by allowing the clutch to actually operate a lot longer than the OEM clutch. The OEM clutch pretty much taps out about 38 miles an hour, where this clutch right here will go all the way to 50 miles an hour.